Hey, everybody. Thank you for tuning in today. Roy, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, James. It's a Friday. Friday morning helps.
Yeah, and the weather has finally turned where we're at here in Lincoln. I feel like there should be a high school football game and maybe pumpkin spice lattes passed around.
They will be here before we know it, man.
They will be. I'm going to take a drink of water in my CH colored glass. It's not branded, but if you want some CH merch, you can go to our website, resources tab, CH merch, and you could spread the news about what we do through
I
some
like our
cool
merch.
t-shirts. That's great.
You've done a good job with that, James.
All right. Well, we're going to do something a little unique here today.
We are.
I'm going to let Roy explain what we're going to be doing, but I will say that what we're going to share, what really Roy's going to share is come out of some work that he's put together for a conference that he's going to be at next month. He's going to be at the CAFO conference. That's Christian Alliance for Orphans. Yep. And he's going to have a coaching table at the conference where he's going to talk about the content that we are going to be discussing today. So Roy's going to really be representing CH at CAFO. We're CAFO members. For those of you listening or watching, you need to know that. It really just means that we partner with this national organization and other organizations like us, some churches, all kinds of different ministries as we care for children and families. So Roy, why don't you just introduce the content that you're going to be sharing today? Maybe share a little bit more about what a coaching table is at CAFO. Maybe there's some people listening who are like, I want to go to this. How do I go? So I'll let you share.
I never thought about that, but yeah, that's good. So when we talk a lot about, if you've been following us for any period of time at Christian Heritage, our vision statement, our purpose statement is we exist to see vulnerable children flourish through adversity and trauma. Obviously, that includes their families. But one of the things that we talk a lot about here is it's not just if we desire and long for children to flourish, then families need to, at some level, to be flourishing, and the organizations serving those families need to be flourishing. Kids, we can't just expect kids to flourish without changing the environments by which they are participating in. And so that includes the home, that includes churches, that includes schools, and that includes us. We've talked a lot about, these aspects of flourishing within our organization. And, it's a mixed bag. I mean, it's challenging to be a flourishing organization with the work that we do, from the ways that we hire, the people that we put in seats and roles and their responsibilities, and having a good HR program and benefits and compensation, and the services that we come along, foster families and adoptive families, like all of those things need to be working towards this desired outcome. And the work we do, and I think the work that anybody does, schools or churches or homes, we all have to acknowledge at some level it's just messy and dysfunctional. And so how do you work through those things in a way that ultimately for us is redemptive? That's ultimately our heart, is that what we do is redemptive. It points people to Jesus. Even when I make a mistake or I disappoint, forgiveness is a central theme through our, Christian faith. Forgiveness is super important. That means at some level, I got to own some level of mistake or sin in my life. But there's a way to do that. It's flourishing too. And so we don't try to cover that up. We just try to be super honest about it. And so I think that's why this is such an important conversation when I think about, going to CAFO, or when I think about our day-to-day work here at Christian Heritage. It's messy, but there are practices, there are principles by which we can live by to be a flourishing organization. Or, this training that I'll be doing, this coaching that I'll be doing at CAFO, is how to become a connected organization. What does that look like? What are the principles of that? And so just sharing just information. I mean, for those who aren't aware, Christian Heritage is my first job. I got my master's degree in leadership and liberal studies. I've had a lot of work around understanding change management, understanding group health, positive work environments, healthy cultures, And so, part of that is taking a lot of those learnings over the years and just putting it into a more TBRI language, and kind of our outputs, with the way we care for kids here and in our homes is we use trust-based relational intervention. So our goal is, so what does that look like, not just for the care that we provide kids, but how we care for each other as staff, as well. So that's kind of the heart behind the stuff that we're going to unpack, probably in this podcast, and who knows how long it, will need. I'll try to condense it as much as I can, but I do feel like why this is beneficial for a general audience is I think every day we're navigating change in our organizations, in our churches, in our homes, and we don't necessarily know what's going on. And we all have this kind of visceral response to these things, emotional responses to these things. It is an election season. Like there's so many things that can disrupt. And I do feel like the content that we're going to talk about is helpful. It's insightful, in regards to navigating those things, and just would love to share our learnings as an organization, in regards to that.
And I think a lot of what you're going to share applicable for churches too. Churches are organizations.
Absolutely.
Typically, unless you're a really small house church, you're an organization. And so I think a lot of this stuff will be applicable if you're a pastor or a leader or an elder or whatever in your church. I think you'll have some benefit from listening.
Yeah. So if you're okay, let's just kind of dive in. I
Good.
think it would be good. And so, a big part of understanding the need for change, honestly, comes from a passage in scripture in Jesus' teaching. It's found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But I'll be reading here from Matthew 9:16 through 17. And this is kind of the NIV version. But no one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch will pull away from the garment, making the tear worse. Neither do people pour new wine into new wineskins. If they do, the skins will burst. The wine will run out and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins, and both are preserved. James, I think what Jesus is getting at the heart of a little bit, and just for context, is Jesus was being questioned about fasting. Jesus was, there were some teachings about John the Baptist, and they were asking Jesus' disciples why they didn't fast and why the Pharisees did. So this is the context for this, what Jesus is talking about. And really what Jesus is starting to get at, to the heart of this, is a little bit is this new gospel that he was ultimately fulfilling was coming to pass. And so these old rituals and traditions, kind of represented the old garment. They represented the old wineskin, which weren't really compatible to the reality of the kingdom that he was bringing. Yeah. And I think, there's such truth to that when we think about, being a trauma-informed or trauma-responsive organization, that some of the way that we've approached this in the past is not effective in terms of reaching for us what are vulnerable children and families today. The need has shifted, and although sin is sin, and there's really nothing new under the sun, I get that, but there are new understandings about our brain and how our brain responds to loss and wounds, and how our brain responds to trauma. I mean, we're learning lots of new things. These new things should inform our approach to what we believe about evangelism, what we believe about discipleship. And when you look at a lot of the factors impacting of biblical literacy, when you look at the destabilization of the family unit, when you think about all of these things, using old techniques aren't the most effective. And so part of behind becoming a trauma-informed or trauma-responsive family or organization or church is really understanding what that is and thinking, well, we can just keep doing what we've always have done. And the reality is we can't. We have to do things kind of differently. Your thoughts on that, James?
No, I agree. I mean, I think when Jesus is putting it into the context of the old covenant is passing, the new is coming.
Right.
And that's a theological idea. but I think the application then broadens to, everyday life, where you could even say, I mean, you could even apply that in non-Christian context. But for us as believers, are we beholden or attached to old systems, traditions, or rituals that ultimately are not helpful for people? And when my mentor, when I was a pastor, introduced this to me, I mean, he would say, like, you can't just keep putting Band-Aids on things to try to fix it.
Right.
You need a new system for a new day, for a new era, for a new time, whatever it is. And so I agree. And I just think, especially when it comes to some of the things we talk about here at CH and in our field, right, that I'm not an expert in. I'm not an expert in brain science and behavior, but I've learned enough to know, man, we can hold tightly to the tenets of our faith while also doing things in a new way, so that people actually are helped and not hurt. So that, again, we're not attached or enslaved to, well, this is actually how Christians have always done it. Well, you're actually living in a way that Christians did things in the 1800s, but we live in 2024.
Right.
What is going to help somebody who's suffered or been abused? What's going to help them? And then as we think about organizations, how do we need to behave now so that we can help those children?
Right.
We need to behave in new ways. Man, you think like, well, 50 years ago, it was like, oh, your family's struggling? Well, tough it up, do your job. Okay, that might not be the best approach today from what we know about research and, again, brain science and trauma and connection. Is like, that's actually not going to get the most out of people at their job.
Right.
So yeah, I love it. And I know as a leadership team, we've talked about this idea.
Yeah. And as a leadership, right. And as a leadership team, we've talked about, we don't see TBRI, right, trust-based relational intervention, as just, hey, we just need to train our staff so they can support our families and making sure that our kids are getting good trauma-informed and responsive, care, whether that's in the home or through case management. But we've talked about, like, this has to infiltrate every aspect of the way we do human resources, the way that we run our senior leadership team, the way we handle our all staffs. And this is a work for us because, we're part of that. So as humans, we will have our bents and we will have our slants and we have our own stuff that comes out based on our previous experiences. But, our goal is if this is what we aspire to be, how are we moving towards, in that direction? That is both really two things. It's both being biblically informed, and then I think looking at the latest science and data and all of those kinds of things that like, how do we allow the Bible to inform that? And we've talked about this relentlessly here in this podcast, and you've talked about it, that we believe that Jesus was one of the most trauma-informed and responsive people who have ever lived, which is really getting at the heart of the gospel, the gospel narrative. And we see that the way he dealt with sinners and tax collectors, and his response to them was very different at that time to how the church, so to speak, was handling those kinds of situations. And so we do know that Jesus introduced a whole new way of thinking and processing about that. And so this is this kind of, for us, this new covenant perspective of, like, what are the implications now for us in the modern church, as we look at, the many issues and complexity of the issues that churches face today.
I would even say, so, right, I threw this agenda up, and I got ahead of ourselves, so I'm going to go back here. But, like, what you just said made me think, there's this saying in biblical studies or theological studies that the kingdom has come, and yet it's not yet fully come. Right. And I think that this is an aspect of this, because what you just said is, like, Jesus is the most trauma-informed and responsive person who's ever walked the face of the planet. But what they knew in the 1st century, and what they knew in the 5th century, and what they knew in the 10th century and on, we are still learning. And then we could all admit we're still learning things about Jesus. Like, you can read the Bible year after year after year, and you still read things about Jesus.
Amen.
Why would we ever admit we know everything about the brain and behavior and trauma
Right.
We're always learning new things. And I just think as Christians, we come to the table and say, God is sovereign over the entire universe, including behavior and brain science and recovery and
Right.
healing. So why wouldn't we be open to saying we're still learning what this new wineskin really looks like?
Right. And its application isn't just for, I think, how the church talks about the lost.
Yep.
The application is for us.
Yep.
And how we need to constantly be available to his leading in our lives and our effectiveness. And at some level, the data is overwhelming that at some level we're losing our effectiveness as the large C church, as the big C church. And I think those are the things that we wrestle with as an organization. But I can't say this is everybody else's fault and not do this really hard internal look at how well are we doing on a day-to-day basis. And I'll tell you, some days we do really great and other days we don't do so great. But we have to be intentional and strategic with wanting to be that connected, trauma-informed, trauma-responsive organization. That's not just true for the foster kid. It's true for our foster care specialist. It's true for our beyond prison worker. It's true for our director of financial services. Like, it's got to be a part of how we live and breathe and think, every single day and of every single moment of every day. And so that's kind of what we're going to, again, lean into a little bit. So,
all right, now I'll go to this agenda. Why don't you just give an outline of what you're going to cover? And again, like Roy said, we might not even, this could be a super long podcast that we chop up or just leave it as one. But so why don't you just walk through kind of how you'll go about this conversation today?
Yeah. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually define culture. And when I think about culture, I'm specifically talking about organizational culture, but don't think that's just for the workplace. It's in our church. It's actually in our homes. It's any time you walk into a facility or when you walk into a Walmart. Every Walmart is different, although maybe their aisles are the same, but because of the people running those aisles and cleaning, they're going to have its very specific culture, just like me walking into a McDonald's. Like, all of those things has its own level of culture. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then we're going to talk about its role in organizational health. We're then going to talk about the tasks of change. And I will tell you, the task of change is just a significant learning that I learned way back when I was working on my master's, and it's always has stuck with me as I navigate change myself personally, but as we've navigated a lot of change here at Christian Heritage. So we're going to talk about that. Then we're going to talk about TBRI. So we're going to kind of give a broad look at felt safety and some connecting principles, and then specifically what that means in regards to the organization itself, not necessarily for how we look at through the lens of children. So just applying that. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about.
All right. Well, let's get into org culture.
Yeah. So part of that is just looking at kind of organizational health. Is just some just quick data points. It talks about that 92% of employers cite employee experience as a top priority for their organization, over the next 3 years. So that's kind of a picture here in 2024. Survey data from Gartner reveals that only a mere 13% of employees are fully satisfied with their experience. So you'll have employers saying, hey, 92% is the employee experience is one of our top priorities. But, those who are experiencing a mere 13% of employees are actually fully satisfied with their experience. So you can see a massive disconnect. A collection of pulse surveys point to various conflicts likely driving to disengagement, which is chief among them, including a lack of sufficient management, leadership training, and onboarding. So just a picture of what are those behaviors that are leading to actually really poor employee experience. And those are some examples. So just a couple other points, just data and surveys. A lack of support and recognition from managers and leaders, especially young workers under the age of 35, complain about a lack of recognition or reward for their contributions, a lack of opportunities for personal and professional growth, a lack of regular feedback, and the leadership's overall ignorance or oblivion as to what's not working in the workplace and why. And that's going to be a really critical one that we'll be unpacking, is the disconnect from kind of the boots on the ground in the organization to the really the decision makers, strategy drivers of the organization, and really the disconnect with that. And then the last kind of bullet point is top reported causes of turnover in 2023 include, again, a lack of recognition, a lack of advancement opportunities, poor culture and management, and then just the inflexibility and being overworked.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a couple definitions of culture. I have a couple quotes here. One is Edgar Schein, who's, considered one like the organizational guru when it comes to organizational culture and management. He says culture is not a problem that needs to be solved, but rather a framework that a group can use to solve problems. And then I love this quote from Todd Whitaker: the culture of any organization is shaped by the worst behavior the leader is willing to tolerate. So culture, if you want to go to the next slide. So what is culture? So, and how would you define it? So the way I define it is culture is defined by the why you do something, and it's seen by the way we do things around here. Mm-hmm. So it's why we do something, but it's the way we do things around here. And every home, every organization has the things that define their culture. And that's both formal as well as informal in regards to that. So here are some elements of the ways that we would then talk about the why and then the how. So there's climate. So an element of culture is the climate. What do you do and how you feel about where you're at, wherever that might be. Mm-hmm. An element of our culture could be our mission and vision, what the organization aspires to be and how it will accomplish it. I'll give a really quick example of that. We do surveys all the time here, quarterly, regular surveys of our staff talking about their experience with us. So we lean into really understanding the day-to-day stuff. And one of the things that we see oftentimes is usually maybe this would be true for the church or nonprofit, especially true for nonprofits. Typically, there's a high level of response to feeling connected towards the mission and vision of the organization. We love what we do. We love what we stand for. But then when you start getting under that a little bit and you get below the surface of that, then you're going to start seeing some disconnects with that validation, or I don't feel heard or valued at my workplace. So although I have high affinity towards the mission and vision of that, our climate might be not as high as a level as our mission and vision. And so, for us, being one, knowing that information is then how do we continue to build bridges of increasing and getting our climate to the level that our mission and vision is. So mission and vision is not just simply enough. Yep. It's also the climate that helps really drive that. And then there's a lot of other things that go into culture. Our language internally, again, stuff that you might use in your home or stuff that you might use in your workplace or church. It tells us who is informed and who is not. So language or understanding that or how we describe those things are elements of our culture. Again, good, bad, and different, but language is very informative. Our routines, rituals, and ceremonies. It tells you what we value by our routine, what we celebrate, what we don't celebrate, the ceremonies that we have. Again, tells people who maybe are walking into the organization for the first time. It immediately tells us, well, what does this organization value? So those things will dictate that. Norms. So norms are very interesting than your employee handbook, or norms are kind of the unwritten rules that maintain unity and order. So norms would be, I remember when my wife and I were house parents at a residential school. Mm-hmm. When we first walked in, I think every home had a 300-page binder. It even had diagrams of how to properly vacuum a carpet, right? There should be V's in the carpet. But those are kind of the rules. But a norm would be if you would go into the bathroom where our girls would go shower and get ready, is some of our older girls were saying, well, you can't use these sinks. These are for the, us juniors and seniors, or you can't use this toilet stall, or you can't use this toilet paper. And they're like, well, that's nowhere in our handbook. Yep. But those were some of the norms. And again, norms could be positive or negative of You wouldn't find that. Every church has them. Every home has them. Every organization has norms. And I would tell you, oftentimes the norms trump whatever the written
Whatever the
rules
rules.
are. So you need to know what your norms are within your organization. You got to know what those things are, those unwritten ones. Our rules, so org charts, job description, processes are parts of culture. Stories. Stories are really powerful. So when you think about what people say, and again, this could be true of a family. Remember when Aunt Bertha would, tell these stories, and, Aunt Bertha hasn't been around for, 90 years, but that story or our response to how things are described, that just carries on. Right. I think of some of the organizations I've worked at, when I think of my time at Focus on the Family, there were some very powerful stories about who Dr. James Dobson was and how God would ultimately be intervening in the organization's story. But those stories were told on a regular basis. When I worked at Milton Hershey School, at the residential school, I cannot tell you the amount of stories that were told about Milton Hershey and his love of children and building that town. Like those things just transcended, almost in some sense. I'm sure some of them were even urban legend at some point. Like they take on a life of its own, but those stories are just really important parts of our culture. Heroes, who we prize. And this is a really fascinating one too, is just identifying in your culture, who are your heroes? Why are they heroes? What about them, both current and past, or even real or fictional, kind of talk about, again, an element of our culture. Values and beliefs, what we believe, and ultimately is what we reinforce. So, a lot of organizations have kind of their core values. Oftentimes those core values are aspirational, but they're also what I would say most organizations try to reward or model around those kinds of things. Yep. And then part of it is just subculture. So within every main part of that culture, there are definitely some subcultures under that level. So those are just some elements of culture. I know that's, kind of, not getting into each one of those deeply. That's a training in and of itself. But I think from just a broad macro view, there are lots of different things that inform our culture. And you do need to be aware, like if you want to do a true culture assessment, you should be assessing each and every single one of these things as you want to have kind of a full picture of the organization, your home, your church, in terms of who you work with.
I think it's important to remember too, you have a culture. I think a lot of people just think, oh, well, it's just what we do. No, like you said, when you walk into a Walmart, it has a particular culture. And so I think, an easy example is, in the United States, you might think, oh, well, man, in Italy, they have so much culture. No, they have Italian culture in Italy, right? And you have your culture in Walton, Nebraska. But you don't often see it. And so, if you're doing an evaluation, I love what you said, like you have to list these things out and think hard about them because they exist. You just might not know they exist if you weren't intentional in setting them up.
Well, and that goes back to the previous part of that previous slide is, our culture is often defined by the worst behavior we're willing to tolerate. Yep. And so, I don't think you should look at culture as good and bad. Mm-hmm. I think there's aspects of every culture that's healthy and unhealthy. I think part of what you have to work through and establish is ultimately, is our culture allowing us to achieve what we ultimately aspire to? And I think this is where most organizations can get tripped up on. I think this is where a lot of churches can get tripped up on. So again, that's why you've got to be very aware of, you could be a church and have one of the worst cultures ever. And one of the most unhealthy cultures ever. And there's a lot of different things that could influence that. It could be a person who's not the healthiest, who's in a position of leadership. So it really is being able to step back and really look at those things and then have the courage to act on what's healthy or unhealthy, or, kind of working towards that. I kind of look at it through the lens of, John 15, where God prunes. I think elements of our culture need pruned constantly. And what I love about what, Jesus talks about in John 15 is that there are even branches that are bearing fruit that need to be pruned. So fruitfulness isn't always a good measure of whether or not our culture is where it's at. So I think, again, you got to have a good handle on who we are, what we believe about who we are, then those outcomes that are being produced by the culture, and is there alignment with those things? And again, you're going to have to assess what you're comfortable with and not comfortable with, knowing like, okay, this is where we're at. This is where we need to be. How do we get there? And culture has a lot to do with that. And so you're going to kind of see that here in the next slide. And for those listening is, okay, so then how do I assess my culture? Well, first, and I think this is bedrock, is their trust. Trust is this human basic need. And honestly, you're not going to have a connected organization if you do not trust each other. It's impossible. So I think part of that is your ability to assess how well do we trust each other, and from a trust-based relational, I would say a trauma-informed perspective, is there felt safety? So it's not just physical safety, right? I could walk into a church and I know that they have, people there as security who I feel physically safe when I go, but it could be an emotionally wrecked church where I will never open up. I will never share about my struggles or how I can really ask for prayer in a way, because although I feel physically safe, I do not feel emotionally safe or relationally safe in that. So I think every culture has to assess, really, that's the basic level. Another great question is there resistance to change or new ideas? And then why? This really gets to the heart of the old wineskin versus the new wineskin. Old wineskins don't necessarily want to give up their wineskin. They like the power, the position that comes with that. And so if there is resistance to change or new ideas, you really have to ask the hard question of why. Why is that? Another question I think is super important is what gives a person status in your organization? And is that formal or informal, right? So a good example of that, James, is I'm the chief executive officer in my organization. That is my formal title, but informally, I might not be a really great leader. I'm a great manager, maybe of people or those kinds of things, but just because I have a title doesn't give me status in my organization. And so part of that is really being able to assess that. So what gives a person status, and is it formal or informal? Another really big one. And so, in a previous life before Christian Heritage, I actually worked with schools, both public and private. I've worked with a couple of churches, more kind of the youth group side of things, on just having healthier culture. So I've worked a lot with schools. And when I would go in and assess a school, I would always look at how conflict is resolved. So I would find, or I would ask, hey, so talk to me a little bit about conflict. Is it seen as a healthy thing? Is conflict seen as unhealthy, or is conflict just swept under the carpet, or is there open dialogue about that? And so one of the things that I do in terms of assessing a culture is, how is conflict resolved, and is it healthy or is it unhealthy? Is leadership trusted? Why or why not? How are decisions made? And then how are those decisions communicated? Is another way that I assess culture. I always love talking with new employees or people that are new to an organization. I'll ask them, like, what seems strange to you? Like, what's odd? What is it that you like? What just, like, it's weird. And that's where you really find out about norms. That's where you find out about stories that are being told that might not have been through the onboarding process. People are told, hey, go to this person, don't go to that person, even though that person they should go to is their direct report, right? It's just all of those things. Like, this seems strange. So that's a great question, I think, to ask, especially new employees. And then I love this kind of spectrum which, by the way, isn't completely comprehensive, but it does allow me to gauge certain things out of the gate. So where would your workplace fall on the following spectrum? Praise versus criticism. So again, depending on where that spectrum is, you just learned a ton about your
Yeah.
culture, which then goes back to some of the organizational health things that we looked at, right? 92% of employers cite employee experience as their top thing, yet only 13% were like, dude, I'm not fully satisfied with my experience. I guarantee praise versus criticism is a big part of that validation that goes on in terms of the employee experience. Do you see problems as an opportunity versus problems as a crisis? If I see problems as an opportunity, I will tend to think is, okay, here's an organization that's probably a lot healthier in terms of the way it problem solves, as it makes decisions, as it solves, when you think about risk management, if they see it as opportunities, I think it's going to be a lot healthier. But if everything is a crisis, I will tell you that would tend to fall for me in a little bit more on the unhealthy part of the culture. And then we talk a lot about this in terms of, here at Christian Heritage, is, do we believe the best about each other? Or are we believing the worst about each other? And that's a great way to assess your organization as well, is what do we believe about each other? And then how does that manifest itself in the way that we talk about each other? And part of that is not just the way we talk about each other face to face. It's how do we talk about each other when that person's not in the room? And that's really where you see that kind of come out. And again, that's the part that you've got to address. Like, okay, how do we address that? Not how we are in front of each other, but when we're not in front of each other. So those are just some great ways to assess your.
I love those. I think that's great. Those are some pretty probing questions.
Yeah, and they're hard questions.
They're hard. You're going to find some things you're like, I don't like the way I answered that.
Or you're not going to like what you find.
Yep.
And again, I think in leadership, especially when I think about leadership, we have to ask these things.
Yep.
If not, like, if it's one of those things like, well, I don't, from an election perspective, well, I don't really like any of my candidates. Well, you don't really have a choice over that. But what you do have a choice is you are required to vote. Like, you've got to, like, you need to be able at some level, with your conscience, make the right decision. It's the same thing with our culture, is you can't stick your head in the sand. You might not like what the options are, or what you're going to learn, but you've got to do the work. If not, then I will just tell you, you have an unhealthy culture. If you're not willing to learn what it is where your culture is at, I would just tell you, then you're contributing to an unhealthy